Hello, I'm Catherine Comden, Behavior Program Manager at Willamette Humane Society in Salem, Oregon. Are you the type of person who cares about how animals are treated? Have you ever seen an animal that looks neglected or abused and wondered if you should get involved? And if so, what should you do to ensure that the person responsible is criminally charged? In Oregon, we have a special prosecutor, Jake Kamens, for animal abuse and neglect cases. He's joining me on the show today to teach us how to identify and report cases of animal abuse and neglect. Find out when, how, and why you should take action. If you care about animals, you won't want to miss this week's Pets and People. Jake, thanks so much for being on the show today. I appreciate you taking the time to be here.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So you are the Deputy District Attorney for Animal Cruelty here in Oregon, for the whole state of Oregon.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that position and how it came to be.
Sure. Well, in 2013, a nonprofit group called the Animal Legal Defense Fund, which for years has helped prosecutors around the country work on animal cruelty cases, came up with the idea to create a position where one person has the responsibility of handling animal cruelty cases throughout an entire state. And Oregon is where Animal Legal Defense Fund has some of their offices. They partnered with the Oregon District Attorneys Association, which is the trade organization for all of the DAs in the state, and the Benton County DA's office, which is in Corvallis, and came up with the position of Animal Cruelty Deputy District Attorney. Now, the position doesn't handle every single animal cruelty case in the state, but is available on an as-needed basis for the various DAs throughout the state.
So if a county is prosecuting a particular case and needs some assistance, then you're there to help them.
That's right. They can call me if it's a resource issue, if it's the case is more complicated than they would normally see, or if it's a media-heavy issue, they can call me in and I can assist on that.
That's a really important way to help the different communities because they may not have the resources otherwise. Is that right? Because I'm hoping that we don't see enough of these cases generally, that every county is dealing with them on a daily or weekly basis. So that's really important that you're there. So how often are you traveling to the various counties to give them assistance?
I travel a lot. You know, I work out of my home in Portland, and I have cases currently pending in Polk County, Marion County, Curry County down on the coast, Lake County way down in central South Oregon. So I'm on the road a good amount of time, and I don't do a whole lot of cases in the metro area around Portland because those offices have a lot of resources and they don't tend to need special prosecutors to come in.
That makes a lot of sense. So you've been doing this since 2013.
That's
and
right.
Tell us a little bit about your personal story. How did you end up in this role?
Sure. Well, I graduated from law school, Lewis and Clark, 2009, and went right into working as a prosecutor for the Multnomah County DA's office. So when you work at the Multnomah County DA's office, when you just start out, they sort of give you a mix of all different kinds of cases, anything from disorderly conduct to drunk driving or assaults, and in that mix were a number of animal cruelty cases. So as I was working at the DA's office, I ended up handling my fair share of animal cruelty cases. And one case in particular I worked on was an animal neglect case. It was a woman who had a one-bedroom apartment with over 40 cats.
Wow.
Dead and alive.
Oh dear.
And she was charged with a number of counts of animal neglect. And a legal issue came up when we got to sentencing. She was convicted on all counts. A legal issue came up, and I actually touched base with the Animal Legal Defense Fund at that that point to see if they had dealt with this legal issue before. They had some briefing that they supplied to me, and I argued it in front of the judge, and he agreed with me and, did what we asked him to do. That was my first exposure to the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and that sort of sparked an interest in me generally in prosecuting animal cruelty cases specifically.
Yeah, for sure. And so about how many cases have you been involved in since you accepted that position?
Sure. So there's a couple of different levels of this. The cases that I have actually been assigned on to be the deputy district attorney in charge of is over 125.
Wow.
And that doesn't count cases where I get a call from law enforcement or the public or deputy district attorneys that are working on their own cases, and I just give them general assistance on it.
I see.
So the ones that I've actually taken over, I've done over 125 since I started in 2013.
You're a busy person then, because then you're also coming alongside and just giving them supplemental information or helping them, find the details that they need to prosecute the case.
That's right.
Or you're taking a case all on your own and basically taking it over then and seeing it through.
Yes. I also do a lot of education work, outreach to the community like this, to law enforcement who don't see as many of these cases as they do for other kinds of cases, and humane societies and animal rescue groups. So I spend a lot of my time talking to various groups and teaching them about what the laws are, what the procedures are, how best to take on these investigations so that you actually have a rock-solid case by the time you get to trial.
Right, and I definitely want to touch on those topics. But first, can we take just a quick look at sort of what is the state of our animal cruelty laws and kind of the position that we're in as a state looking forward? Like, how are things now in our state?
Oregon does very well with animal cruelty laws. We have a very robust set of laws to deal with both animal abuse and animal neglect. There are both misdemeanors and felonies that can be charged depending on how serious the crimes are. We also have a very strong pretrial forfeiture statute, which means if you've been charged with a crime against an animal and the state or the county has seized that animal, while you're waiting for trial, the state or the county or the organization that's holding the animal can go to the court and ask the court, please forfeit this animal to us so that we can rehome this animal while this person is awaiting trial. There are some things that could always be done a little bit better, a little bit stronger, but the state of our animal cruelty laws is consistently ranked one of the best in the nation.
Fantastic. That's really good to hear. So if people are wanting to get involved, then they're likely to see something happen because of that. It's going to there'll be some follow through.
Yeah, if a law has been broken, then you can expect that there are some serious potential consequences for the person who's done it.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what constitutes abuse and neglect. Tell us what the difference is and how we can recognize it as community members.
Right. So, when you're thinking about animal abuse, you're generally going to be thinking about somebody who is either intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly hurting an animal.
Okay.
So torture is animal abuse, or causing abrasions, bruises, cuts, things like that.
Okay.
And there are different levels of it. Of course, it can be a misdemeanor if it's a less serious assault, or it can be a felony if it's more serious, or if somebody has certain priors in their criminal history. Animal abuse is a little bit different than animal neglect. Animal neglect is when somebody has an animal in their custody or control. Either they're the owner of the animal, or they're the person who's put in charge of the animal by the owner. They have some legal responsibility to care for the owner.
Okay.
And though they have that legal responsibility, they fail to provide the animal with what's called minimum care.
Okay.
And minimum care is further defined in the statute.
And is there a difference between, say, minimum care for sheltering livestock versus minimum care for sheltering companion animals like dogs and cats?
It gets very complicated. What I'll tell you is that the law, generally speaking, says minimum care is care sufficient to preserve the health and well-being of an animal.
Okay.
Right? And then it goes down a list of things which under the law constitute minimum care.
Okay.
And for domestic animals, your dogs, your cats, it says that minimum care includes adequate shelter, right? It doesn't say that livestock animals, as a general rule, require shelter. However, the list that's included in the statutes is not an exclusive list. It means anything that impacts an animal's health or well-being in that fashion can be a breach of your minimum care obligations. So if you have a horse, for example, that needs to be inside, you know, it has rain rot, it has some kind of condition, or if you have a cow that needs to be separated from the herd because of some kind of veterinary condition or some kind of other condition, then you need to do that because it's your obligation to care for your animal.
Yeah, for sure. And I know our customer service representatives sometimes will get general phone calls from people in the community who are concerned about animals that they're observing out. And I think one of the more common ones that they get is the whole idea of being able to tie your dog up outside. And that's, I know it's a complicated issue because for many of these people, they don't have an option. You know, they're working, they're trying to sustain their families, they're gone all day. How can they keep their pets? But I guess talk to us a little bit about some of those issues with tethering and what is or is not neglect, and how do we navigate that?
Sure. Well, tethering is something that really was put into the laws around the same time that I started in 2013, early 2014. Tethering your animal, unlawful tethering, is a violation level offense. So it's not a crime per se, but it's a violation level
like
similar
a
to a traffic ticket.
Okay.
Exactly. And what the law says is, well, you can't, you know, there's things that you would think are obvious. You can't have an animal tethered to a leash that's too short for the animal to move around.
Okay.
Obviously, if the animal can't breathe, if the animal can't move around, that's not appropriate. You also can't have an animal tethered on a choke chain or a pinch collar. However, if you have an animal tethered on a regular collar, what the law says is that you can have that animal tethered for 10 hours out of a 24-hour period, or 15 hours out of a 24-hour period if they're attached to some kind of running line where they can sort of go back and forth.
Right. So the expectation is that these are companion animals that can then come into the home when the people are home or go for walks with their people or have that need met in other ways, and then kept safely confined even if the person doesn't have the luxury of a fenced yard by tethering while they're at work.
Yeah, and there's a couple other nuances to the law. Like, for example, if you're with your animal, it's not that time doesn't count against you. If you're standing there in the yard or doing yard work and you have your dog tied up.
Gotcha.
There's a couple other exceptions. I would encourage people to check the laws, you know, directly if they have a question or a concern, or call local law enforcement.
Yeah, and find out. And I just make a little plug for Fences for Fido, who is going around in the community and helping install fences for people who don't have one and would love to have other options. So check out Fences for Fido if you haven't seen that before and you do have a dog that needs to be tethered because you're away so much. They love coming out and helping install fences, and they're very busy doing so.
Yeah.
So it's really fun to see that happen. Well, thank you for explaining that to us.
Sure.
That's fantastic. And then what about if a dog is just being left outside in the yard and is just maybe barking the entire time, and you peek over the fence and maybe he has food or maybe he doesn't have food? How can we know, I guess, when to get involved, and what sort of things should we look for if whether it's dogs or cats or other animals? How can we become involved is the bigger question.
Sure. It's been shocking to me how many of the cases that I've gotten have come to law enforcement's attention because of a concerned neighbor or a concerned family member. You know, and it's one of the things that I oftentimes talk about when I'm doing closing arguments on these cases, or I'm summarizing these cases for the jury, is that animals really don't have the opportunity to speak up for themselves. So they really rely on the people in the community seeing them and bringing to light the conditions that they're living in. Generally speaking, I would say people, in my experience working in this job, have pretty good instincts. You know, they call when it's appropriate, and they don't call when it hasn't gotten to that point. And when I say call, any kind of law enforcement should be able to handle, you know, at least the basic steps of starting an animal cruelty investigation. City police, county sheriff's departments. Very often cities and counties have animal control officers that work for them, the dog catchers.
Right.
They are aware of the animal cruelty laws in the state. The Oregon Humane Society has an investigations unit with certified police officers whose sole job is to investigate and arrest and charge people with, ultimately, criminal offenses related to animal cruelty. And they're available throughout the state. So no matter where you are in Oregon, you can always go to the Oregon Humane Society's webpage and make a report if you're not getting any traction with local law enforcement, which I know there's a lot of resource issues out there, but if an animal is suffering, an effort really should be made.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. I didn't know that. I thought that they were just local. So you just taught me something. That's fantastic that there's that resource. And I think they have 2 or 3 full-time officers now that are doing that. Is that?
I think they have 2 full-time officers and 1 additional person who works with their investigation unit.
Fantastic. So what are the steps that we should take as community members and as people who care about animals if we suspect that there might be neglect going on? How do we help you make a case?
Sure.
What are some of the things that we can do as we begin to approach law enforcement?
Doing it at the time that it happens, as opposed to waiting to make a report, is always helpful because there are issues of resources. Police can't necessarily respond right away to every single call, but if they get it in the line and then they go through their process and they get to it, it's always better for it to be sooner than later. So if there's an injury on an animal, it hasn't had time to heal. If they've been neglected, they're still in that state and they haven't, passed away, God forbid, or run away. I also, it's very important that people remember, what it is they saw when they saw it. So what I'm suggesting is, a lot of times these cases, the incident will happen, and then you won't actually be in trial testifying about it for 6 months, 8 months, a year and a half. And the criminal justice system can just stretch things out like that. And it's better to have written something down or taken a picture or recorded something,
something that's going to make it
something
salient.
That's going to remind you about what happened.
What you actually saw, so that you can be sure of it when you're asked about it a year from now or something.
Right.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And then what kinds of words can we use to express to law enforcement that we have a concern? Is there protocol that we need to follow, or when we make that call, we just say, hey, I've got a neighbor down the street, I think he's not treating his dog right? Or are there things specifically that we should be saying?
Yeah, I don't think police tend to expect that people are going to speak in full legal paragraphs when they call. I think you just make sure you don't leave any details out. Tell them why it is you're concerned.
Sure.
What's the basis? How long have you had the opportunity to observe the thing that you're concerned about? How serious? Have you had experience with pets? And based on what your experience was, that this is not how this should be going.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that information. And now I'd love to hear some of the true life stories of where you've been able to be involved and make a difference.
Sure. I'll try to keep them generic and not gross, because sometimes my work can get a little difficult.
For sure.
I worked on a case a few years ago in the Salem area where a woman who had been visiting her relatives had seen the defendant walking her dog, and the dog just looked awful, matted, and she couldn't even kind of tell what kind of dog it was. It was so dirty. She called the Oregon Humane Society. The Oregon Humane Society sent an investigator out. That investigator, like I said, is trained in the animal cruelty laws, knocked on the door, asked to see the dog, And sure enough, it was just matted. When he put his hands on the dog, he could feel the bones through the mats.
Oh, no.
And it was just a real mess. He spent some time talking to the owner about, what it was that was going on with the dog and how it got to be this bad. The dog's name was Zelda. And there were just no real satisfactory answers as to why the dog got into the shape that it was.
So it wasn't like she had reached out for help and no one was willing to help her. Or she had, because we have ways to help people. We can definitely, if people get in touch with our local Humane Society, the Willamette Humane Society, we'd be more than happy to provide them some resource lists and ways to get some help for the pet. But in this case, no, she had just let it go.
Right, way too long. Eventually, the Humane Society investigator convinced the woman to surrender Zelda to the Humane Society. They brought her in, got her all cleaned up and clipped the nails. It turned out that Zelda had actually gone blind due to some dry eye issues that hadn't been treated.
Yeah.
So had some chronic illness issues. And we ended up charging her with animal neglect. She pled guilty. And as a result, she's not allowed to possess domestic animals for 5 years.
Okay.
She had community service work and she owed some restitution. She was on probation for a little while. And that's the kind of thing that I deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
Yeah.
That can be really difficult for you personally, but and for the people that are getting involved, how are they feeling when they're, it must be difficult, especially if it's a family member saying, I've got to bring this to someone's attention. What's your feedback from the people who choose to get involved in these kinds of cases?
I think it is difficult because people generally don't understand exactly how the criminal justice system works, and especially people don't understand how long the delays are.
Sure.
They get very frustrated, and sometimes they see the result, and the result doesn't in their mind sort of line up with how bad the behavior was.
Right.
And what I try to tell these people is, there's a lot of discretion in sentencing that judges have, and we try the best we can to resolve the cases without having a trial so that people don't have to take the stand and there isn't that risk of an acquittal or something like that. What people should always keep in their mind is that we're doing our best for the animals.
Right.
If this is an animal that has been abused or neglected, we're doing the best we can to get them better care for the rest of their lives. And Zelda ended up having to be euthanized shortly after due to an unrelated medical condition. But I'm proud of our involvement in that case and my involvement in that case because she actually had some time towards the end of her life where she was getting adequate care, where she was cleaned up and in a loving area, where she was able to experience that.
And she knew love. And I definitely understand what you're talking about. There's times when animals will come into the shelter for one reason or another, and you can tell that they've not necessarily had the best of a life up to that point. And even if they get as far as our doors, I love how our volunteers love on them and get them cleaned up. And it's just a wonderful thing to watch them blossom under our care. And then if we are able to adopt them out, then all the better. And they can go, we even have people who are willing to adopt hospice animals and take care of them till the end of their God-given days, and it's just a fantastic thing. So.
Yeah. It's never ceased to amaze me how much help there is out there for people and their animals if they just look for it. The state of Oregon is a state of animal lovers. We have, people and organizations and people that devote their careers to working in nonprofit organizations that are just designed to help animals, dogs, cats, horses. There's an alpaca rescue group up in Washington. It really needs to be, said that if you are in a situation where you know that you're not providing your animal with adequate minimum care, it's your obligation to go out there and look for these resources, to do something to make sure that your animal is cared for.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd love to come alongside and help. And I love the piece that you're talking about bringing more information to the community. And I'm excited that you're coming to our community locally to give a live presentation at the shelter in July for our Pet Talk series.
Yeah.
So be sure and join us on the second Thursday in July this year. And you'll come and talk to us if people have specific questions. You're invited to come and ask questions there and find out more. And so again, Jake, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for joining us as well. Please come on down to the Willamette Humane Society in Salem, Oregon, where you just might meet your next #1 fan. Hi, buddy. Hi, honey.